Japan, an ancient culture which spans thousands of years. Japanese legend says that the islands of Japan were formed by the tears of a goddess. As each tear fell into the Pacific, an island formed in its place. In peaceful times, Japan was an elegant land of water gardens, cherry blossom, and poetry. At other times, she was torn apart by the fearsome warriors of the ancient samurai. These men, much feared, were also revered as the most powerful people in Japan. Its history reveals an incredible story. Although archaeological evidence reveals the existence of a Neolithic culture in Japan, the first period of which there's any in-depth knowledge is the Jomon period. This stretches way back from 10,000 BC up to 300 BC, when the land was peopled by nomadic hunter-gatherers. The Yayoi period, which followed, led to a major transformation in Japanese culture, with the development of new tools and water control systems. This made wet rice cultivation possible, changing the face of the land forever. The hunter-gatherers became settled farmers who formed small communities. In turn, distinct political groups began to form. Japan entered a new phase with the tumulus period of 300 AD. A clear break with the Yayoi culture happened as political and social institutions developed rapidly. During this age, huge earth and stone tomb mounds appeared along the coast. They were called tumuli, hence the name tumulus period. These housed the dead rulers of various independent kingdoms. As time went by, one clan based in the Yamato Plain area emerged as more powerful. By the 6th century, the Yamato Sun line controlled the hierarchy of clans, and subsequent emperors descended from this line. Buddhism arrived in Japan from Korea in the 6th century, during the Asuka period. Emperor Yomei and all succeeding emperors were Buddhists. Chinese writing techniques had arrived 100 years earlier, making Buddhism more accessible to the nobility, along with Chinese philosophy. By the end of this period, the Japanese were also starting to adopt the Chinese model for a central government. During the Nara period of 710 to 794 AD, the system of centralized imperial rule, or Ritsuryu system, as the Japanese called it, was fully enforced. This set the pattern for subsequent dynasties. The Ritsuryu system continued into the Heian period, but began to crumble in the 9th century. Individual lords built up their own military powers, leading to feuding amongst themselves and the loss of the emperor's imperial power. During this age, there was also a breaking of ties with China, with the Japanese creating their own writing system. Throughout the Kamakura period of 1185 to 1333, an administrative structure run by a shogun, or commander-in-chief, was set up. Individual landowners employed private armies to defend themselves, and the samurai warrior evolved. The shogunate form of government run by the warrior class at a distance from the imperial city was to endure for 676 years. The cult of the samurai continued from this period in Japanese history right through to the 20th century. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the Japanese army still lived by the code of the samurai. This fanatical, devout code, combined with the cult of emperor worship, produced an aggressive fighting spirit which conquered huge swathes of the Pacific in early 1942. In less than a year, Japan had gained control of East Asia and the Western Pacific. This occupation was brutal, and the roots of its discipline lay in the cult of the samurai. Eventually, the tide would turn against them, and with that bitter defeat, the last real links to an ancient tradition were finally swept aside. But it did not die so easily.
The samurai are a well-known aspect of Japan throughout the world. It's mainly through Kurosawa films initially, and then things like that, Seven Samurai and other Hollywood remakes after that. The word itself comes from the verb samurao, which actually means to serve. So the samurai were initially the policemen, the military for the aristocracy in Japan.
The samurai role was initially one of policemen, protecting the property of the wealthy landowners. This role gradually altered as they became private armies serving the lords. Eventually, the sheer number of soldiers precipitated a period of fighting known as the Age of the Civil Wars.
Warriors came to have a major role in society when civil war developed, and this was in the 12th, 13th century, when there were wars between the major clans or coalitions of the clans. And obviously the daimyo fighting it out had to place a premium on the warriors.
The warrior's choice of battlefield weapons would be the katana, which is known as a samurai sword, the yari, the spear, and the naginata, which was the halberd. Also employed with the samurai on horseback, which would be the ones we use in the kyudo, which would be the bow and arrows. All these weapons were related to the samurai and were used in battle. However, should an incident occur where the samurai was disarmed, for example, the sword was broken or took off him in some way, they had to resort to unarmed combat. Unarmed combat was a necessity. It was kill or be killed, and they had to really rely on their unarmed combat skills, which over the years has now developed into a very effective self-defense means.
In order to service the samurai and the armies of the daimyo, of course, there were large craft industries. When I say large, I mean that they were little local workshops, but they covered a large number of activities. Samurai very often was a soldier on horseback, and so in preparing him for war, you had, of course, to prepare his horse, and so most of the castle towns did have provision for smiths and for preparing things, leather goods for the horses. So all in all, the activity of war and the samurai society did give industrial employment in a society which was broadly agrarian. If you think of sword making, here you have very sharp swords made from what we would call medieval times with remarkably primitive equipment. And even experts in the field today, I think of them as excellent by world standards.
The samurai sword, the katana, was the soul of the samurai. To look at the samurai sword, you would see a slight curvature. They say that the kisaki, which was the tip of the sword, would be the face, and the soul of the samurai would be embedded into the sword. The sword was crafted in a very, very special way, so that you had a finished product that wasn't brittle and wasn't soft. It was a mixture of the two combined. Researchers say that some swords took up to 3 months to make.
The sword was of great spiritual significance to the samurai. They believed that the swordsmiths who crafted these swords had supernatural powers. It was essential that before making the blade, they prayed to the gods to help ward off evil spirits. The iron would then be hammered and folded around 20 times, creating a blade which could cut off an opponent's head with just one stroke. The samurai battle dress is just as complicated as the weaponry. Japanese fighting men of the period carried flags strapped to their backs, which identified them as part of a particular clan. It would often take hours to dress for battle in their armor. Some samurai attempted to create faster methods of preparation, hanging the suits from the ceiling and lowering them down onto their bodies. The armor was made from small overlapping iron plates, which were joined by brightly colored cords to form a decorative and protective skin. On top of this, a breastplate would protect the body, along with iron gauntlets, leg shields, and neck collar. A huge variety of increasingly gaudy and fantastic designs were to be seen as rival warlords sought to outdo each other in style and ferocity. Black, shiny lacquer overlaid with gold was a favorite form of decoration. Surely the real ancestor of the Jedi Knights in Star Wars films must have come from here.
The armor, known as a yarai, was worn mainly by the top samurai. In fact, the more important they were, the more heavy padding they had. So the hierarchy soldiers, the generals, the commanders, they would have more protection. They would be the first ones that they tried to kill. So if they were shot with arrows, they would use their yarai and all their protection, give them a better chance of surviving an attack with arrows. That's just one example of why the armour was worn, but obviously it was to give them as maximum protection as possible whilst in the battlefield. The kabuto, or the samurai helmet, headguard, these would come in various designs. There was no real specific design. Each clan had their own distinguished pattern or design. Some would have horns. In fact, the more scarier and evil looking they were, the better. This was the same as the frontal face mask, what they wore in battlefield. The nastier it looked and more evil it looked, the better. This was to obviously try and scare the opponents.
Battle masks were not only worn by the samurai men, but also by their small, tough horses. Even the harnesses and saddles would be decorated with beautifully intricate designs. The masks for the samurai horses were crafted out of leather. These were designed to complement the terrifying appearance of the warrior, giving the horse an equally bizarre expression.
So during the civil wars, obviously there emerged quite a lot of different clans. Soldiers would group themselves, and each clan would obviously have to have the better on the other clan. And so each clan would have their own special training, which was unique to that particular group. Clans were known as ru, which were schools. So that each clan had its own ruha, or particular techniques which they practiced, and these were kept secret. Obviously, if another clan or school would find out what they were using, then they could very easily defend themselves from it. So it kept secret, and hopefully they would get the better advantage over their opponents.
It was argued that the samurai had a right to rule because of virtue, and that meant that one had self-discipline and was not after profit, therefore was into service, was loyal, and also that one was studied and learned and became scholarly in a sense of pure in that way, virtuous in that way. So this was one aspect of the cult. The other side of the cult, though, is that one is absolutely fearless. In other words, willing to die for the security of the country, the security of one's lord. These two aspects. One, that you were virtuous, that you weren't interested in profit like the merchants or anybody else. This distinguished you and gave you, therefore, the right to rule. But at the same time, there was a long tradition, of course, of the samurai, essentially a lone swordsman, the fellow who's interested in his honor as an absolute aspect, and was willing to maybe, if his lord was killed or someone affronted him, fearlessly seeking revenge for that. This sort of, not exactly cowboy-like, but in some ways the cult of the Ronin, the masterless samurai, the one who maintains this fierceness, but without seeking essentially training, but also seeking a master to follow, to serve.
Japan was frequently shaken not only by the warring lords and samurai, but also by the forces of nature. The Japanese archipelago is directly over one of the most seismically active areas in the world. Nature sent not only earthquakes, but typhoons and severe rains, causing flooding and landslides. This meant constructing buildings which could withstand such forces. The famous use of thin, paper-like walls served a practical purpose so that earthquake victims were not trapped onto piles of masonry. Gradually, it evolved into a more decorative style, using more robust materials. The fact that Japan has the world's oldest and largest wooden buildings suggests that Japan had considerable success in outwitting the elements. Common architectural features can be found throughout the country, despite the great variety of climates. Most constructions basically consist of a box with a large roof, which is sometimes over 1/2 of the total height of the structure. Straight lines dominate Japanese architecture, and curves only tend to appear on roofs and eaves. Chinese architecture and city plans were adopted in the 6th century. Buddhism also arrived in Japan in AD 552, bringing with it a host of architectural and cultural features.
Religion in Japan, both in those days and now, is different in concept from what we're used to in Western Europe, in the sense that you do not necessarily believe only in one religion, that the concept of religion is much more flexible. And so most Japanese now and in those days could describe themselves as believing both in Buddhism and in Shinto. Now, the focus for Shinto was the emperor in Kyoto, and he performed various rituals to that end. Buddhism was divided into a number of sects. Some of these sects were evangelical and were missionary sects. Others were much more dormant and you might say academic and spiritual. From about the middle of the 16th century, Christian missionaries began to come to Japan. They were initially Jesuits. They brought with them a certain amount of technical know-how from Europe of the day, especially the knowledge of gunpowder, which was totally new to the Japanese at that time. One can understand that in the context of the Civil War which was going on, a knowledge of how to make gunpowder gave all the military leaders a considerable advantage. So there was what you might call a missionary craze at that time, that there was a fascination with the missionaries for the message that they brought, but also for the technology which they brought. But it soon became apparent to the Japanese that the missionaries were themselves divided between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and along later came the Dutch and the English, namely the Catholics on the one side and the Protestants, and the fact that they were bitterly divided. And the Japanese began to realize that this could be a danger, because all these four powers were expansive powers, and that they might at the end of the day have a desire to invade and take over Japan. And so from early in the 17th century they began to impose restrictions on the missionaries and their converts, and later on, from the middle of the century, they positively excluded missionaries. That meant that from 1650 or thereabouts, Japan had really only one contact with the outside world, that is the world of Europe, and that was through a small enclave called Deishima, an island in the island of Kyushu. And there they allowed a Dutch colony to continue to trade and to teach Japanese things like medicine. And most Japanese ports also had vessels going to China. But the operations at Deishima and also the operations to China were very strictly controlled.
There was a long period of Japanese isolationism which endured from the 1650s to the 1850s. This allowed the separate development of some very typically Japanese cultural institutions, which are very distinctive from the West. The formal nature of Japanese society is reflected worldwide in living cultural exports such as martial arts. These still provide a direct and very vibrant link to a ritualized military society of the samurai. Its roots can still be traced in the precise discipline and lethal grace of this most Japanese of traditions.
During Japan's feudal era of almost incessant civil wars, there emerged a combative form of self-defense, which was designed by the warriors to promote self-protection. The name jiu-jitsu, loosely translated, means the art of gaining victory by yielding. Other names, such as the art of flexibility, pliancy, and gentleness, also are relevant to the name Ju. It is said that jiu-jitsu was forged out of necessity and tempered in the heat of battle. Thus, it became known as a legendary fighting art, a real battlefield martial art, which was used by the samurai warriors. Jiu-jitsu was only a small part of the Japanese soldiers or the warrior class exercises and arts which were practiced for the battlefield.
Ordinary peasants had very little power of freedom in Japanese society. The samurai were at the top of the hierarchy, and only a son of a samurai could become a samurai. The samurai could kill an ordinary person for the slightest reason, without the need for any explanation. Administration of the land was still at this stage firmly in the hands of the daimyo, the separate lords. Each daimyo became what he was by right of conquest, using their powerful armies of samurai to improve their position. The shape of Japanese history up to around 1600 had taken a similar pattern. A power vacuum was created by the death of the leader Nobunaga in 1598, who only left an infant son to inherit. The political situation was not resolved until 1600. A famous warrior called Tokugawa Ieyasu managed to defeat a coalition of lords from the western area of Japan. This famous battle is known as the Battle of Sekigahara. It made Ieyasu the de facto ruler of the country. He was not simply a regent, but a member of the Minamoto, the shogun family. After consolidating his power, he was faced with the difficult task of creating a viable system of government out of the conflict of a decentralized administration system and his own strong central power.
There were various successive samurai groups that controlled the center of government from that time, from around 1200 and through the 16th century, various periods of stability and instability, civil war, as most countries, of course. But then from 1600, the Tokugawa family was victorious in a major battle, probably one of the world's most interesting battles in terms of military history, because it was one of the first major battles actually won by the musket.
The Battle of Sekigahara enabled Tokugawa Ieyasu to secure primacy over all contenders. And this began the era of the Tokugawa rule. And how he did it was that he created his own family as shogun, which really only means military leader. Now, up till that time, the nominal head of the country had been the emperor in Kyoto. And in order to detach himself and his family from Kyoto, he moved the capital away from middle Japan, the Japan of Kyoto and Osaka, and moved it to Edo, Tokyo. Strangely enough, he did not try and get rid of the emperor. He accepted him as a spiritual head, and he addressed him always with total respect, if not veneration. On the other hand, he always kept spies from the shogun bureaucracy in Kyoto.
Tokugawa was most interested in security because they had actually gained their power by betraying the previous family and taking over. So they were interested in stability. The samurai as bureaucrats, they wanted them to be self-disciplined and good in everything, but not to have any lone wolves or anyone who was, because someone bumped into them on the street, suddenly to pull out his sword and cut him down.
So if the country was to be at peace, the important thing was to control all these warriors. In order to absorb the energies of the warriors, the Japanese government, the leaders of the day, planned an invasion of Korea, the idea being to export all these energetic young men who were really out for carnage, for killing. Indeed, I mean, an invasion of Korea took place in the 1590s. But that was a typical instance that the warriors were inclined to get out of hand at that time.
Tokugawa Ieyasu's control of the daimyo was so successful that his family supplied a long line of shoguns who ruled Japan for 2.5 centuries. With his success, shogun once again became an essential word in Japanese vocabulary. But in order to control the daimyo, the Tokugawa shogunate were forced to take more and more extreme measures.
Shogun controlled the daimyo by insisting that every other year they should spend in Edo, the capital. And that meant that they were away from their own territories and couldn't stir up trouble, creating their own armies and attacking the Tokugawa. And in periods when they were not in the capital, they insisted that the daimyo should send their wives as hostages to Edo. And so if they misbehaved when they were back in their home territories, the wife would be held to account.
Women were traditionally used by the samurai for the service of political marriages, or seriaku kekkon. These helped to cement clans in different alliances. The political marriage was such a powerful weapon that Tokugawa Ieyasu banned it on his rise to power. Sometimes the woman's own clan would expect her to spy on her husband's family, putting her life at great risk. It was quite acceptable for a husband to take concubines, but his wife was expected to be completely loyal to her lord. If she was found guilty of adultery, it was her husband's duty to kill her. The concubines fared just as badly, being no better than servants. Foot binding, the deliberate breaking of bones, leading to painful deformation of the feet, was one of the indignities suffered by women right up until the turn of this century. Small feet were believed to be more beautiful, but binding masked a more sinister motive, one of actually constricting women's movements. Japanese gardens reflect all the harmonious aspects of society with a sense of ordered, elegant formality. In times of peace, gardens were considered fashionable places for the samurai to relax, deep in contemplation and writing poetry. The gardens included a balance of water, stones, and bridges, and their formal nature still reflects Japanese society today. The unification of Japan meant the role of the samurai had to change. The daimyo were no longer allowed to run large private armies. The feudalistic system, which required practical training to kill in battle, had been replaced, and if the samurai were to survive, they needed to redefine their role in society.
During the Meiji Restoration, which took place in Japan, all feudalistic type training was barred. Therefore, all soldiers, samurai, had to hand in all weapons, such as the katanas, the swords, spears. They were confiscated. And so what happened was, to get away with the need to carry some type of weapon was still there and in demand. Samurai carved wooden swords. This was known as the bokuto. So instead of cutting the opponent, they would bash them, simply because using something like a white oak, a very hard wood, would still cause considerable damage to an opponent.
From 1600 until 1868, there's almost no major war in Japan. So the sense of the martial arts developed. In many ways, we think of them today as not as sport, but as one keeping in fit, and a cult of the samurai sword. It was in times of peace that the cult developed, because the samurai had to define themselves and raison d'etre, because in the society which had placed them at the top, they had to, have a theory legitimizing that position.
During this period, called the Edo period, the samurai became an urban class, moving from the country into the castle towns and cities. Although they only represented 7% of Japan's population, within the towns they made up at least 70% of the community. The side effect of the samurai being forced to neglect their martial arts was that the old craftsmen, such as swordsmiths, saw a severe decline in their trade. The economy of the castle towns flourished, however, as the samurai adapted into their new environment.
Over that period of 2.5 centuries, the class structure changed, or at any rate the power which each of these groups had changed. At the start, it was still a feudal situation in a situation of warfare or potential warfare. But then after 2 centuries of peace, the samurai no longer had a job to do. At this point, I think one has to say that the samurai diverged. There were those who rose to the top and adapted themselves to a new role, and that role could be as administrators or as school teachers. On the other hand, many of them really were unable to adjust to their new role, tended to become drunkard, and so one of the images you get of samurai in the 18th century is of layabouts who just go around in these castle towns and are frequently to be found in the brothels. A great decline from the high days of Bushido and the cult of the warrior. As the castle towns developed and as Tokyo became something of a metropolis, then there developed a cultural life which had not existed previously. So you had theatres, and you had a playwright like Chikamatsu, who was the Shakespeare of Japan. You had a group of poets who are even now regarded as quite distinguished. You have the authors of the ukiyo-e floating life, woodblock prints representing life in those days. You have development of Japanese music. So Japan was no longer feudal at the at the end of the 18th century. It's becoming increasingly urbanized, and people nowadays in Japan are still looking back on that period as a creative period.
The cult then of the loyalty and the strength of spirit of these men and the willingness to die for honor became the most crucial myth in Japanese drama. So the myth of the loyal samurai has crossed over into the modern period and is still something that has a force, even when many of the other sort of traditional things have languished in the past.
Emperor Hirohito ascended the throne in 1926, and within a decade, Japan was on the verge of being involved in World War. Japan's isolationism had ensured that she was not subjected to the horrors of the First World War, and so the decision to show her strength was made. In 1931, the Japanese military powers occupied Manchuria, and then set up the state of Manchukuo. The military were tired of what they considered to be ineffective, feeble civilian politicians, and were determined to push ahead with Japan's Asian expansion. Throughout the 1930s, military extremism grew, bolstered by the traditional ethics of the samurai. In December of 1941, Japan launched attacks on Pearl Harbor and European colonial holdings throughout Asia. In less than a year, Japan gained control of East Asia and the Western Pacific. The occupation was swift, brutal, and savage. Atrocities always occur in war, but the Japanese army was notorious in its treatment of prisoners of war. It's believed that up to 20 million people died in the Pacific. Samurai traditions of vengeance, combined with their belief that the most honorable way to die was fighting, made the Japanese military an awesome opponent.
One of the main reasons why the samurai were probably some of the greatest warriors of all time, one has to look at the belief that they had. They were ready to die in battle. In fact, one of the greatest honors was to be killed in battle. So you have a soldier who can go into a battlefield with that belief, he's going to be very, very hard to beat. The warrior code was as such that enabled them to carry all these necessities, things like preparing for battle, as well as actual battle itself. Internally they were prepared, as well as obviously the technical side. And I think the combination of these two together, the skill and the inner belief, made them very, very strong warriors.
In the modern period, of course, when Japan feels threatened by the black ships of Commodore Perry from America and the forced opening of the country, many of the samurai, the young samurai, were the ones who led the government, the restoration and the reforms and things that came in. And the cult of within the military, both the Navy and the Army, were in many ways, especially in the pre-war period, based on these traditional ideas of the warrior as someone absolutely serving the nation. And with the rising cult in the late 19th century, focused back again on the emperor and absolute loyalty to the emperor.
By 1943, there were signs that Japan's situation was reversible, with its army losing fierce battles in the Pacific. Germany surrendered in 1945, but Japanese leaders stubbornly refused to follow suit. That August, the ultimate weapon of death, the atomic bomb, was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Second World War ended 1 week later. The unconditional surrender of Japan was broadcast by Emperor Hirohito. It was the first time his country heard his voice. Japan lost its emperor's claim to divinity, its empire, and its army. Post-war Japan is now quite different in structure, but the recent history of this century has yet to be properly addressed by the Japanese. The end of the war saw the final demise of the samurai, although the traditional martial arts are still studied throughout the world. There's also a great legacy of Japanese art and architecture, highly coveted by art connoisseurs. Japan underwent dramatic reconstruction politically and economically, and now has one of the most flourishing economies in the world. The horrific events of this century have forced Japan to shed the ancient feudal ways and look towards a very different future.